Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mike. Hey, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for your patience. Just are still recording this for our webinar, but we're having a few issues with the audio for that. Sometimes other speakers come in and there's some changes made, so we're going to try and get those resolved. So just be patient with us if we have to do some audio tests in the middle, but we're going to go ahead and start this version now. So I would like to welcome our guest speaker today, Jane Downing. She's Executive Director of the Center for Hope and Safety in Marion County, and I will let her give you a more thorough introduction, but she has a very distinguished biography and history in working in domestic violence victim support and survivor support in Marion County. I do want to thank you all for being here. My name is Teresa Rainey, forgot that part, with the Equity and Inclusion Council. That's a member of the employment department here that provides assistance and recommendations to our executive team on matters of equity and inclusion within the employment department. And if I could have the Equity and Inclusion Council members who are present, as usual, stand and be recognized, please. Thank you very much. And we have folks up in the booth as well, helping out with our support for our field offices and other state employees who are joining us today. So thank you all for your help in making this event happen. In honor of Domestic Violence Heritage Month, again, we'll be here until 1:30 talking about employment protections and more information around domestic violence. But I want to again acknowledge that everyone here today probably came because you know that we are all affected by domestic violence in one way or another, whether it's our own selves, our friends and family, or even a stranger on the street. We all have opportunities where we see that we might be able to help someone or be that support person for them. And I'm really glad that Jane Downing is here to help us understand better ways that we can do that. And I wanted to share a story too about something that happened at our central office. Who was here at the picnic? That was a fun day. But what not everyone knows is that one of our employees actually too had an opportunity to assist a survivor that very day as they were on their way to the picnic. And this was Tim Dunks, our facilities and safeties manager. Is Tim here? I don't see him. Okay. But I know he's on his way down. And Tim and his wife here were walking towards the picnic from their parking, and they heard a scream. What was happening, and they saw that there was a woman being assaulted in a car. Now, at this point, there are so many different things that someone could do, and I would never judge anyone for which decision they took, as long as they did something, right? Just to do something is important, and it's a very personal decision how and in what manner you might intervene in this situation or try to render assistance. But in this case, Tim and his wife went to the car. They yelled so that the aggressor stopped what he was doing, and then they simply asked the woman, "Do you need help?" And she said yes. They said, "Would you like to come with us and we'll help you call the police?" And she said yes. And she got out of the car. They brought her here to our own building and stayed with her until the police arrived. The aggressor was arrested, and the woman was taken to the hospital. And it's a very lucky thing she did, because at the hospital they found that she had severe internal bruising in her throat from being strangled, and that's a serious medical concern. So I just wanted to again acknowledge, even though these stories are hard to hear, these are what we're going to do. It's important about that in advance and know what we might do and the best ways to try and assist. So without further ado, Jane Downing, thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you. Appreciate that. It is my honor to be here with you today, and appreciate that you're taking the time to learn about a subject matter that can be difficult to talk about. And just so you know who's in front of you, as you were told, I'm Jane Downing, the Executive Director of the Center for Hope and Safety. Some of you may know us from our old name, Mid-Valley Women's Crisis Service. And we changed our name about 4 years ago because we want to make sure everybody knows that we don't just help survivors that are women, we help all survivors. And crisis, a lot of times folks thought that was mental health issues. And And so we wanted to say what we really do is hope and safety in our community. And so we changed our name. I have been working with victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence for 28 years now. I started as a hotline volunteer and have been the executive director for 21 years. The other thing that I want you to know about me that's pertinent to today's training is that I am also trained in batter intervention. And those are the programs that work directly with perpetrators. I don't do batter intervention because for me it would be a conflict to work with victims and with perpetrators. But part of what I'm going to be bringing you today is what those perpetrators say within those groups. I think that's really important information to understand what's the thinking behind what's going on. And I've had the privilege of training now over 35,000 individuals. I stopped counting at 35,000 because it was just like, you know, it was too much. But part of that, those 35,000 were really important for this type of training. And the governor signed an executive order a few years back and said, we're going to make it mandatory for all supervisors, managers to have training on domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in the workplace. And I was privileged to train over 5,000 managers and supervisors in the state of Oregon. Went all over Oregon to do that. And our agency trained 8,000 during a 2-year period. And what I found over and over was that every department, every workplace was touched by domestic violence. And so it's so great that you're taking the time to come together and say, I want to learn a little bit more. Because there are very clear dynamics to this. There are things you can do. A lot of times people say, I'm not sure what I could do in the situation. I'm not sure what to say to a coworker. I'm not sure what to say to a staff member if you're supervising someone. I'm going to give you ideas about all of those things. And I help develop the state of Oregon guidelines for when you can get help in those situations. I've also come to many agencies and did walkthroughs. If you have someone in your workplace that you're concerned that they're unsafe, I will come and walk through your workplace with you and talk to you about ways in which to make that as safe as possible for them and for all the employees that are there. And so I've responded, unfortunately, to some workplaces where there has been a domestic violence homicide, and that's heartbreaking for a workplace. So I always want to offer the ability to say, let's do some safety planning up front, right, before that ever happens. So just know that that's available to you. We are going to do a quiz together. And because we have a short amount of time today, I want you to know that we probably don't have a huge amount of time for questions. But on this bright yellow sheet of paper that you have in front of you, my phone number is on here. I want you to feel free to call me. What I believe is that if you have questions that go unanswered, it creates a barrier between you and someone that you may be trying to help, whether that's family members or coworkers or friends. So I want you to know, it doesn't have to end here today. You can continue to ask me questions. I love it when people do that. They follow up and say, hey, this made me think about this. Because what I know is chances are today, I'm going to say something that goes against something that you've read about, heard about, or believed about domestic violence, maybe even based on your own experience. And when that happens, the first thing that happens when I say something that goes against something that you've believed is you're going to go, well, that can't be right. So what I know, though, is if you get a chance to ask those questions, you get a chance to kind of process the information, every time people will come back to me and say, you know what, that makes all kinds of sense to me now. So I want to offer you that opportunity even as we leave here today. So call me up. Keep having those conversations. I'll come back if you want me to come back. Sometimes people go back from this training and say to their coworkers, I really wish you would come. The Department of Revenue had one training one time of 20 people, and they said, that's it, we're doing one training. Those 20 went back and said, you got to go to this training. We ended up training 1,000 Department of Revenue employees. So if you find this helpful, I'll come back as many times. We do this as part of our mission, to change the dynamic. The more people that have good information, the more people will be supporting survivors. And last year we had more than 26,000 contacts to our program. Even with those 26,000 contacts, we know we're not reaching everybody that needs our help. So you get to be a part of that if you so choose to make sure people have good information. So with all that said, you're gonna walk through this quiz with me together. And one of the things I wanna make sure we know up front so we're all on the same page is kind of some definitions, right? So when we talk about domestic violence, we are talking about a pattern of behavior, a pattern of controlling and coercive behaviors that one person uses against another to gain power over them and maintain control. And I also included a definition for stalking, repeated and unwanted contact that places someone in fear, and that fear is reasonable. And so if you have questions about stalking behaviors, because we're going to talk some about that, because stalking is always a part of domestic violence. And when it comes to the workplace, you're probably going to see it more, that stalking kind of behaviors, than anyone. So with that, you all are going to help me. You're going to tell me, what is the greatest risk factor for being a victim of domestic violence or stalking? What do you think? Oh, you're a good group. Go home. You don't need my training. What we know about domestic violence and stalking is that chances are, the vast majority of times, about 90 to 95% of the time that we talk about domestic violence and stalking, we are talking about male perpetrated on violence on females. That's not to say that there aren't times when that's female to male or female to female. That absolutely happens. But the majority of the time that we talk about these topics, we are talking about male perpetrated violence on females. Now, when I say those high numbers, those don't come from shelter programs, hotline programs like ours. They come from really radical feminist organizations like the FBI. Oh, you're going to be a tough group today. Radical feminists, FBI. But I don't like to use the FBI statistics, because what we know is some precincts report, some don't. You get weird numbers all over the place. I like to use statistics like the San Diego Police Department made the commitment to talk to the children at the scene of every domestic call. And the children reported that 95% of the time, the male in the household was the one that was being abusive. I think that's better research, because we'll be able to look at it over time and say, does this really hold up? Now, when I use high numbers like 95%, do you think I'm saying that 95% of men in our society are abusive? What do you think? No, absolutely not. It is actually a very small percentage of men in our society that are abusive. What is a reality is that those abusers go from partner to partner to partner. In one batterer intervention program that I work with, they ask every man who comes into the program, how many of you are with the partner that you were arrested and you came into this program? And how many of you are with a new partner? 100% of them say, oh, I'm with that first person, and I'm with a new person also. And so you have a very small percentage of individuals who are impacting a great many people in our community. And if we know that, we can do things about that, right? We can, if we understand that that's just a small percentage who are impacting other people, we can look at it. Now, sometimes people will say to me, I want a training on female perpetrators. I want to understand it. What I can tell you is a perpetrator is a perpetrator is a perpetrator. Everything I tell you today is going to be the same dynamics for if that's a female perpetrator or a male perpetrator. You don't need another training. And they are going to use all the same tactics that I'm going to talk about today. So you can know that. If you have other questions about that, though, I'm happy to talk to you about that also. I've worked with victims who are female, and I've worked with victims who are male. I've worked with victims from the LGBTQ community, all across the board. Any folks who need it, that's who we're there to help. So you all are good at that, but most of the time when I do this training, most folks actually mark poverty. And usually they are folks from social service organizations, and they'll say, oh, we see a lot of victims come in. For example, the Department of Human Services, they've done surveys and found that up to 50% of their clients who are females have past or current domestic violence as an issue that they're dealing with. And so they always mark poverty. Well, you have to be careful about where you get your statistics from, right? If we were only looking at our shelter, we'd say, oh, there's a huge connection between domestic violence and poverty, but who's more likely to come stay in our noisy, crowded, wonderful shelter? Someone with a lot of resources or someone with very few? Chances are, if they have a Visa card, they're going to go to a motel, right? And probably not come to our shelter. The reason why we know it goes across the board for all socioeconomic backgrounds, though, is because on our hotline, we're hearing from all of them. And someone in $1 million home just has a different barrier than someone who doesn't have access to those resources. Chances are someone living in $1 million home probably has a lot of pressure on them. Don't leave, your children won't have access to that money, right? Middle income, one of the things that I found most often when I was doing all those trainings was abusers would get victims, their finances so intertwined, they couldn't see their way to get out. If I leave, I'm not going to be able to even make it. And so every socioeconomic background just has a different barrier that they're dealing with, but they absolutely have barriers, right? When it comes to race, here in Marion County, we have a relatively, and I say relatively because Oregon's not the most diverse state, but we have a relatively large Hispanic Latino population and Russian Old Believer population. And when I'm out doing trainings, it's very common for someone to say, oh, there must be a lot more domestic violence, say, in the Russian community. And I'll say, really? How do you know that? And what I hear most often is, well, I knew this family, and this person was abusive, and they've therefore taken it and put it across an entire culture, which we all know you really can't do, right? But I would have told you growing up that there's a lot more domestic violence where there's white males who are loggers who drink on Saturday night. Now, where did I grow up? One of those great little logging communities in Oregon, right? I was in a training one time and a man guessed where I was actually from, and that doesn't happen very often. And I said, how did you know that? And he said, I grew up there too. No one can argue that that's our experience, right? And yet what we know today is there's not a single culture that isn't dealing with domestic violence and stalking. I wish there were, so we could point to it and say, everyone emulate this culture, but there's not a single one today that isn't dealing with domestic violence and stalking. When it comes to religion, abusers will use the religion, especially of the victim, to say, you have to do what I want because the tenets of this faith say this. What I want to say to all of you is there is not a religion in the world that really, when it comes down to it, says it's okay for you to hurt your intimate partner. There's not one that has that as a tenet of their faith. And so, but abusers will use religion. Now, today, given this question, I am going to use he for perpetrator and she for victim, because if I do the he, she, he thing, not only will I need more time, but I will do something like what I did in one training where I said perpetrator, and a woman raised her hand and said, is that a perpetrator in Idaho? Yes. I will mess up my words, and you all can laugh if I do it today, because I think it's hilarious when I do it, and I'll be laughing at myself. But if I do the he, she, he thing, I will really have trouble today. So bear with me. Just know that when I use one or the other, you absolutely can know it can be the other way around. And probably everyone in this audience could talk about a situation that they know of about that. So I understand that. I'm just doing it for the sake of being able to not try to make up new words for you today. So, more than 1 in blank women in Oregon has experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner. What do you think about that? Okay, 1 in 3. What about other folks? Do you have any other numbers you used? I didn't tell this story. I usually tell this story where I say, I was once in front of an audience of 80 Rotarians, and some of you may know Rotary is a service organization. They do nice things out in the community, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I said, if any of you don't learn at least one new thing, I will pay you $20. Well, I work for a nonprofit. I can't afford that. So we'll see at the end, though, if Teresa would owe you $20, right? I can't help but tease her. But that's, I'm not making that. But did anyone have anything else other than 1 and 3? Okay. So we had lots of different ones, right, from folks, and that makes sense because we don't always know. The Centers for Disease Control have the most recent statistics, and even those are getting a bit outdated, so I hope they repeat them pretty soon. In 2010, they did a study all across the United States, and what they found in Oregon is actually that 37% of women in Oregon will be victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking in their lifetime. Think about that. Think about that's 1 in 3. Think about your workplace. How many women are in your workplace? And chances are you're dealing with some survivors there. And so it's important. Now remember, that's a moment in time glimpse, right? So we don't know if they were victimized in Oregon. We don't know if that number is going to, always be that number. But I will tell you, based on my experience, and especially based on those experiences doing all those different trainings for the state of Oregon, it's a reality for the world that we're living in. And so if you think about that and translate that to, your family, your workplace, everywhere you go, chances are you're dealing with a lot of survivors. And that's really important to keep in mind, because what we say and how we do work with folks really does make a difference when it comes to these issues. The 1 in 8 might have been a stat you had heard before. There actually was a study done in Oregon. It's an old study, but it was an important study because they said not only how many women will be a victim given any certain year, and they found about 1 in 8, they did one further thing that I wish they would repeat with every study. They said, who did you turn to? 80% turned to friends, family members, co-workers. Unfortunately, they were rated the least helpful. Only about 11% turned to shelter programs, hotline programs like ours. We were rated the #1 most helpful. So my goal in doing so many trainings is kind of bring that somewhere in the middle. The more folks won't think we're all those man-hating, male-bashing feminazis at the crisis service, right? Right? You've all heard that? Sometimes people go, I can't believe she's saying that out loud. And the reason I do is because every survivor you work with, chances are, heard, don't talk to them, they hate all men. Don't talk to them, they just want to break up all relationships. Who do you think they hear that from most often? The abuser. And why is that? Yeah, they don't come and get services, right? They don't come and get help. I actually had a manager come up to me after one of those trainings, and he said, if the governor hadn't told me I had to be here, I never would have come, because I did think you hated all men, and I did think you wanted to break up all relationships. And he said, I'm so glad I came and learned that wasn't true. If you think about it, it makes no sense. We all have men we love and adore in our lives, right? We're not so crazy about the ones that hurt other people, but we kind of don't think anybody is, right? The other thing is we don't tell people what to do. We give them options and choices, and they make the decision about what the safest thing is for them to do. If we were to say to them, go here, do this, and they were harmed, we couldn't live with ourselves. And so we are always just giving those options and choices for them to make the decision about what's going to be safest for them to do. But every time a victim believes that they shouldn't come to us because we're going to tell them what to do, or that we hate men, that makes it unsafe in our community. We have 2 male advocates who are fully trained advocates that are there for if men want to talk to another man, there's someone that they can come and talk to. That's important, right? We have advocates from the LGBTQ community so that there's someone that they can talk to that they feel safe with. That all of reducing all those barriers is so important. And every time you can reduce a barrier for someone, that's important too. When is the domestic violence perpetrator most likely to kill their victim? What do you think? Yeah, she runs a much greater risk of being seriously harmed or killed when she's either attempting to leave or has left the relationship. In the last 5 years in Oregon, we've had more than 250 women and children murdered due to domestic violence. In the last year, we've had 4 domestic violence homicides, and 7 individuals were killed right here in Marion County in the last year. It's heartbreaking. What I want you to understand is the vast majority of them had already been out of their relationships. One of them had been out over a year from that person. Another one was getting a protection order that day and was murdered. And so it really is important to understand, if your first instinct is to say to someone, get out right now, you have to take a step back, because you don't know what the safest thing is for that person to do, because you don't know their whole situation, right? And chances are stalking is going to be a part of what's going on for them. And you may be one of the first people to start to recognize that they're stalking behaviors. If you have someone that's showing up in the workplace and their partner is there every morning, maybe comes on break to see them, comes for lunch and spends lunch with them, comes back for the afternoon break, and then is there to pick them up at night, might be some control going on there, right? If you have someone who's getting calls over and over and over, chances are there's something going on with that. If they worry that if you ask them to stay 5 minutes late after work and they're worried that their partner's going to be upset, chances are there's some power and control going on there about they know they're going to get blamed for something if they're not out of the workplace on a time limit, right? On something that has been set up arbitrarily for them. And so you might be the first one to start to think, wow, I wonder if there's something going on here. I worked with a woman who'd had her tires slashed 30 times. She was on a first name basis with the tire folks. Whenever somebody would come in and bring tires that had a little bit of tread left on them, they'd set them aside for her. And people would say to me, well, why didn't she get a camera? Why didn't she move her vehicle? Why didn't she do this? She did all those things. But think about, how long does it take to slash someone's tires? It's not easy. It doesn't take much time though, right? If you think about it. And I was in a training one time and a man said, I don't know, I've never done it. And we're like, oh, that's good, right? that's a good thing. We're glad you've never done it. But you can imagine it only takes seconds. But what's the message in slashed tires? What's the message to that victim? I can find you. I can do this anytime I want to. I can disrupt your life. You may have someone who gets flowers in the workplace. Now, what do you hear normally when a woman gets flowers in the workplace? Oh, see, you all know that. She bursts out in tears and you think, what's wrong with her? If I got flowers, I think that's great. Well, chances are the message was the next time you get flowers, you're dead, or she knows that he's found her once again. And so all of those kinds of things, something that can seem like it's a really nice thing, can actually be part of those stalking behaviors. And because we know that it may be the most dangerous time for them when they're either attempting to get out or have left the relationship, the biggest thing we do 24 hours a day, 365 days a year is safety planning. And we safety plan for if someone decides they are going to stay or if they're going to go. Because sometimes survivors will say, you know what? It's not even about looking over my shoulder the rest of my life. It's looking over my friends and family's shoulders. Chances are that abuser is going to say, you leave me and I'm going to harm whoever it is that's most important in their life. And very often that's the children. And we've had that situation. We had a 12-year-old that was murdered outside of a police station in Oregon. And what you know, the message was to that mom is, I'm taking the most important person in your life, and he killed himself, and no one can touch me. It's the ultimate in power and control. When you hear about murder-suicides, it's the ultimate in power and control. I'm going to take out whoever I want, and no one can touch me. And think about the devastation with that. And so if you start to hear about those stalking behaviors, if you start to question that, feel free to encourage them. Hey, I know somebody that can help safety plan with you. That's what they do every single day, 365 days a year. What are the warning signs of a domestic violence perpetrator? What do you think? All the above. And I'm going to actually have you add one more. And I know some of you don't have pens and pencils, so keep it in your mind. I think it's an easy one. Charm. charm. Abusers are often some of the most charming individuals you'll ever want to meet. It is not uncommon for us to hear, he was my knight in shining armor. He was my Prince Charming. He was everything I ever wanted in a man. And what do we tell women to look for in our society? Don't we kind of tell them to look for that person who seems to be too good to be true? Now, not every charming man is an abuser. Don't go back and say Jane said, because you can have an incredibly charming man who would never ever think of hurting anyone. But charm is such a huge warning sign that we often joke around and say, if you meet somebody who seems too good to be true, run just as fast as you can. Charm gets used to very early in the relationship to gather very personal information about her that he's going to use later on. The number one thing he wants to know is, has anyone ever hurt you before? And if she says, well, yeah, my dad was abusive, or I had a boyfriend who was abusive, he's going to be outraged. Who could do that to a woman? Where does he live? I'm going to go get him. And she thinks she's found someone who totally understands what she's been through, who would never ever do something like that to her, and who's going to be there for her. But when he starts being abusive, he's going to say, see, must be something about you because now there's been two of us. Or he's going to say, you're not going to tell anybody because they won't believe you a second time around. The other thing he wants to know is, she ever even experimented with drugs before? Used them in the past? He's going to say, you tell anybody about what I'm doing, and I'm going to tell him you're a drug user and you're going to lose your children. The threat to take away her children is the biggest threat that abusers use, and unfortunately, it's a very effective threat. The Judges Association have actually done studies and found that 90% of the time that abusers go after sole custody, they receive it. 90% of the time. What are they using in the courtroom to get custody? Charm. And who are they using it against? Who are they using charm with in the courtroom? The judge, yeah. You, after today, may have more training on the dynamics of domestic violence than many of the judges in our community. And so you have a situation where on the one side you have him, typically he's dressed really nicely. I love it when law enforcement takes a picture on the night he was arrested and says, Your Honor, he looked a little different that night. Most of the time they have an attorney that they're paying for. They will have done every class that the court told them to do, and he will look like Father of the Year, right? He'll do everything he can to look like he's a great dad. I've been in the courtroom on way too many times to count where a judge will actually say he may beat his wife, but he's a really good dad. How that's good parenting, I've never been able to figure out. And yet you hear that, right? On the other side, you have her. Chances are her sleep is being disrupted. That's a big part of domestic violence. And do you do your best thinking when your sleep's being disrupted? No. And she may not understand why he's going after sole custody. Very often, they're to share custody. They're not trying to keep the children away from their dad. They're not. And so they don't understand it. Chances are they cannot afford an attorney themselves. And so they're being unrepresented when the other side has an attorney, and that's a great disadvantage. Chances are she won't have done all the classes that the court told her to do. Most often, because in the beginning, he'll say, oh, I'll watch the kids while you go to that class. And then he'll call up at the last minute and say, sorry, I can't make it. And so if you have a situation, if the judge doesn't have good education on these issues, looks at him, looks at her, and says, well, of course, we're going to give custody to him. And we can't tell victims that won't happen. And so you will have situations where they will stay because they will say, I can't risk leaving my children with an abuser. And so that's important to understand, because a lot of times we sit back and go, I just don't understand why they don't leave. Well, our system, unfortunately, puts a lot of barriers in place for them to be able to just leave. And so it's important to understand that. That charm gets used on everyone around her. Think about the times you've seen on television where someone murders their family and they go and they interview the neighbors. What do the neighbors say? How do you all know that, right? Because it happens over and over and over. Because he will charm everyone around her. If she wants to go talk to someone and say, you know, this is happening to me, it's like, oh, no. I was going to ask if he had a brother that I could date. He's so great. And that charm gets used as a way to isolate her. And in the beginning, she doesn't even realize that she's being isolated. For example, She may have a standing date with her coworkers. They go out once a month. She looks forward to it. She talks about it. And he calls her up the week before and says, guess what? I have the best plans for next Friday night. I'm going to make you a really nice dinner. And then I thought we'd go to a movie or dancing. Doesn't that sound great? And she'll say, but remember, I have that thing with my coworkers. And he'll say, oh, I see. You'd rather be with them than with me. I thought we really had something going here. I guess this relationship really means more to me than it does to you. Now, how many women do you know that say, that's right, I'm going out with my coworkers? There's a few, right? But the vast majority are like, what was I thinking? I can go out with my coworkers the next month. No one says, I think I'm starting to be socially isolated here. We don't think that way, do we? But over time, he's going to say, you don't get to be with your friends. I don't like it when you're with your family. And pretty soon, her world gets smaller and smaller. Instead of hearing people say, you're a great and wonderful person, you don't deserve to have this happen. Instead, what she's hearing is, it's all your fault. If you were just a better wife, mother, lover, I wouldn't hit you. And she gets isolated socially. In addition to social isolation, she can be isolated geographically. You may have a coworker who comes here, moves here, has no friends, no family here, and you think, why are they coming here? Well, in one fell swoop, he's taken care of everything, right? She's away from anybody that could be of support to her. She doesn't know what the resources are in that community. It's a pretty effective plan, right? The other way we see this is you have someone who moves from place to place to place in the same community. Why move around a lot? Why do you think? You're not making connections, right? You're not talking over the fence. Hi, how are the kids? Much less likely to call 911. I don't know those people. I'm not going to get involved in this. The third way we see geographic isolation being moved to a really rural spot. Your closest neighbors are 2 to 3 miles away. Again, no one's talking on the fence. No one's calling 911. We have abusers who take the distributed cap off the car so she can't go anywhere. Or she has to account for every mile on the odometer. Where did you go? How long were you gone? We have abusers that will only allow her to speak on the speakerphone when they're there, or they take the phone with them every day. We had one abuser had special locks put on the house that only had a key lock on the outside, and he was the only one with a key. So every single day she's completely locked within her home, and someone said, what if there's a fire? And he said, she has a fire extinguisher. What's the problem? Think about your life if you were completely isolated from anyone that cares about you, right? It's really important. In addition to harm and isolation, you can have jealousy. And this is one of the ways abusers, one of the tricks they use to get their victim even more isolated. Chances are there will be constant accusations of infidelity. She goes to the grocery store, she's having an affair with the grocery clerk. She goes to the gas station, she's having an affair with the gas station attendant. She goes out, she's gone 10 seconds to get the mail. Who's she having an affair with? Now you're all sitting there thinking, she was gone 10 seconds. That doesn't make any sense. Have you ever thought about you can never prove you're not having an affair? It's the perfect accusation to make. You remember in the beginning when I talked about that chances are he is in multiple relationships, the abuser's in multiple relationships, but that accusation, what happens for every victim is chances are they don't have the time, energy, or interest in having an affair, but think about constantly being accused of having an affair. What happens is they pull back. They don't want that accusation coming their way, and so they take a step back and they go to less places. They see less people. They don't want to be accused of that. In the meantime, that abuser is probably in multiple relationships at the same time. And what you'll hear from victims is they'll say, oh, I never thought he could be having an affair because he's always accusing me of doing it. And I figured no one would ever want to do that. See how that becomes that great way to be able to say, I get to do what I want, but I'm going to try to isolate you as much as possible. And that jealousy becomes a really important tool. Now, in that charming part in the beginning, chances are he's telling her she's great at everything, she's wonderful, how much they love them. Chances are they will try to heat up the relationship, and what I mean by that is they're going to want it to go really fast in the beginning. I think you're my soulmate. I think, we should be together forever. Well, one of the things that we know is they're going to go from being charming and wonderful to using emotional abuse. So what happens when men come into batterer intervention programs, they'll usually come in and they'll say, I'm so glad I'm here so you can teach me how to have a good relationship. And the facilitators will say, really? You don't know how to have a good relationship? And they'll say, nope, that's why I'm here, so you can teach me that. And they'll say, okay, let's take a look at that. And what they'll do is they'll say, now what did you do when you were first getting to know someone? What kinds of things do you do? I want you all to think back on your dating years. Some of us, it's been a while. What do you do when you're first getting to know someone? None of us have dated for a while. You go out together, so you do fun things together. What do you talk about? Yeah, you talk about yourself, you talk about them, you ask questions. How do you dress? You dress nicely, right? One man in a group one night said, I take a bath. We are all like, oh, that's a good thing, taking a bath. We're for that, right? You all hesitate. Abusers do not hesitate for a second. If this whiteboard behind me, or it's a projector, but if it was a whiteboard and it was 4 times bigger than that, they would fill it up with all the things they do. I take her flowers, I get to know her parents, I tell her what a great mom she is, I tell her how important her work is. They will fill it up with all the things they do, and the facilitators say, I don't want to hear how you don't know how to have a great relationship. We all put our best foot forward. The difference is they have a motivation behind it. Why doesn't he hit her on the first date? Yeah, there wouldn't be a second date, right? He knows exactly what it takes to bring her into the relationship and what it takes to bring her back into the relationship. When women come into our shelter and they get a letter from their abuser, we'll say, can we tell you what's in the letter before you open it? And they look at us and go, okay. We know that whatever is most important in their life, that's what will be in the letter. If her faith is important to her, he'll say, I was worshiping last week. Where were you? If she had to leave behind a beloved pet, he'll say, Fido cries for you every night. If they were going to build their dream home together, he'll say, I purchased the lumber, I sit on our land, and I wait for you to come home. He will promise her the sun, moon, and stars. And because she doesn't know it's just to get her back, she'll think this time it's going to be different. This time we're going to make it. And chances are she will go back into that relationship because she doesn't know that he's doing that. So he's going to start out telling her she's great and wonderful, to then saying things like, you're not taking very good care of yourself. You're really getting fat. You're really getting ugly. You're such a whore. You're such a slut. And think about the person who's supposed to love you the most in the world is the person now telling you you can't do anything right. The goal of the emotional abuse is to annihilate her self-esteem, to no longer have her believe she's good enough or that anyone else can ever love her. And that emotional abuse is very effective. You think about it. Someone says, to you, we hear this all the time. Bruises go away, broken bones heal. It's the scars on the inside that are so difficult to heal. Because that's the person that's supposed to love them more than anyone, telling them they can't do anything right. The last one that I want you to know about is control. Abusers are very controlling. Over time, he's going to control everything about her, where she goes, who she sees, how she dresses, whether she wears makeup or not, and he believes he's entitled to have that control. He's also very controlled himself, and this may go against everything that you believed about domestic violence. You may have thought if you saw it on television or you heard it in the apartment next door, that person is out of control, they're in a rage. Well, actually what we know is it has nothing to do with anger and nothing to do with rage. And we know it for several different reasons. One is we know that if someone knocks on the door or the phone rings, he can stop just like that. Very often when the police show up, he's sitting back all calm, cool, and collected, and she's the one that looks hysterical. I've trained thousands of law enforcement officers all across the Northwest, and they'll say to me, but when I get there, he acts like nothing happened, and she's the one that's crying and screaming. It's because he can stop just like that. Very often, domestic violence starts out pushing, shoving, hair pulling, to restraining on the upper biceps, to hitting in the head, back, torso, and legs. Why those places? Doesn't show, right? Think about how much control it takes to target punch or target kick someone. If you're out of control, if you're flailing, are you going to be able to target where your punches and kicks go? Now, when you see visible injuries, I want you to know it's really important that you say something. And a lot of times people are like, oh, I thought I should pretend I didn't see anything. That's exactly what the abuser is counting on, is that you will act as though you don't see anything. And victims will say, oh, I shouldn't go out today because I have this black eye. And he'll say, that's nothing, that doesn't show. And every time people pretend like they don't see it, she starts to think, I'm going crazy because when I look in the mirror, I can see it, but no one else seems to be able to see it. All you have to do is say something like, wow, that must really hurt. Did you say anything about domestic violence? No. If she says, I ran into a doorknob, you don't have to say, I don't know any 2'9" women. Don't have to say that. If she says, I fell down the stairs, you don't have to argue in any way. You can just say, if you ever do need some help, I went to this training. I found out about an organization that can help. Those that are going to hear this audio and not have a chance to be in the room or maybe aren't in Marion County, I want you to know there's a program in your area. And so call that program, find out what they have to offer, but say to that person, I know some folks that can help you if you'd like to talk with them. That's huge to be able to do that. To recognize what you see. If they continue to say, no, it's not that, and I'll tell you, there are times when it's not. I worked with a woman, and she played on a softball team, and she got hit in the eye with a softball, and her eye was out to here, and she said, I had all these people coming up to me saying, are you okay? Is someone hurting you? And she said, at first, I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm a victim of domestic violence, and then she said, I realized, look at how lucky I am. I have so many people in my life that care enough to ask, right? A good thing. But there are times when it's not. You don't have to argue with that person. You don't have to figure it out. You can just say, I tell everybody about these resources. That's great. If you do, that's wonderful. If you don't, in that situation, I'm giving you permission to say it's really okay to say you do, because that will make a difference for that person. They'll remember that. The other way we know they're very much in control is because they don't do it to the gas station attendant who spills gas down the side of their car. They don't do it to the boss who says you can't have the day off. They wait and they go home and they do it to the person that they say that they love. The folks in batterer intervention say about 2% of the time they see someone with an anger control issue. The way they know the difference is they are doing it to the boss. They are doing it to the gas station attendant. They're doing it everywhere, right? Those are not these folks. But think about, they're doing this in secret because they believe they won't get caught, right? The last way we know they're very much in control is they've actually done some tests on abusers. Hooked them up, tested their autonomic nervous system, heart rate, breathing rate, perspiration rate. Bring their partners in to talk about a subject that had been difficult to talk about in the past. As he appeared to escalate, he looked like he was in a rage. Heart rate decreased, breathing rate decreased, perspiration rate decreased. He was very much in control on the inside. Isn't that fascinating? You put all this together, the charm, the isolation, the jealousy, the emotional abuse, the control. This is the world that a victim lives in. From the outside, you can look at it and say, that's messed up, right? There's something going on here. Something's not right. But think about, that world has been built slowly over time around her, and from the inside, it's not nearly as clear. And when you start to believe, and every victim does, that it's their fault it's happening, they don't see it as clearly as you will. And so one of the things you get to do is you get to plant seeds for them. You get to say, because you're not going to be able to tell them everything you heard in an hour and a half, right? But you might be able to say, I'm wondering if he keeps you away from your family. Oh, yeah. I'm wondering if he, accuses you of having affairs. Oh, yeah. I'm wondering if he's telling you where you can go and, what you can do. Do you know him personally? Because that's what you'll hear from them. They don't see it for themselves, and you're going to have that broader picture, right? And you're going to be able to maybe refer them to a website. We have one, it's on our paperwork, and you can say, you can get some more information, and you all can look at that if you're working with someone that needs that information. Domestic violence is caused by, what do you think? Other folks have other answers? Okay. Okay? I'm going to talk about these briefly. Witnessing domestic violence in childhood. Right now, you can pick up books, you can read magazines that say if they're little boys, they're going to grow up and become abusers if they witness violence. If they're little girls, they're going to grow up and become victims. What the research actually says is the children that witness domestic violence do not grow up and become perpetrators, do not grow up and become victims, the vast majority. The vast majority grow up and say, it's not going to happen to my kids, it's not going to happen to any other kids if I can help it, and they usually go into professions or volunteer opportunities where they make a difference for children. But that doesn't sell magazines, that doesn't make headlines, unfortunately. What it does do is two things. One is it sends a horrible message to little boys in our society. You witness violence under no fault of your own, you're automatically branded, you're going to grow up and become an abuser. What a horrible message. I was doing a training and a man raised his hand. He said, I was raised in one of those most incredibly violent homes you can imagine, and think about what it's like for me to sit in an audience and have people say, you're going to grow up and become an abuser. Horrible, horrible message. The other thing that it does, it gives abusers an excuse. Not my fault, I witnessed violence as a child. And they will lie about this one, because the hallmark of abusers is they lie about anything. And if they think it'll give them an excuse with the victim or with the community, they'll use it all the time. Now, I want you to understand, a lot of times people say, well, this is learned behavior. They must have learned it, right? Well, there's one batterer intervention program that's doing something that I think is so brilliant. They're turning this on its head and saying, okay, if this were a learned behavior, let's talk about what you learned. And so they interview every abuser in their groups, and they say, how many of you had very significant nonviolent role models in your life? Somebody every day that you saw every day, not on television, but every day that were in your lives that were nonviolent. Guess what? 100% of the men can identify someone in their life that was modeling to them nonviolence. Parents, aunts and uncles that were in their home every day, every one of them. And so when the facilitators say, if you had all this great role modeling for nonviolence, why would you pick violence? Basically, all of them gave pretty much the same answer. Violence gets me what I want. It gets me what I want. Think about it. What does one country use against another to get what they want? Violence and the threat of violence. It works. It's a tool that works. But every time we put out there that children that witness somehow are going to be damaged for life, or they're somehow going to grow up and become abusers, it's sending the wrong message. And I always talk about this because I think it helps people. If every child who witnessed violence in the next generation grew up and become an abuser, we'd already be at 100% abusers. We wouldn't have anybody left, right? It doesn't even make sense when you think about it. And yet abusers will hide behind this one all the time. Alcohol and drugs. We have been keeping stats for years, and we always ask victims, were alcohol and drugs being used at the time the violence took place? The women report to us about 40 to 50% of the time that's the case. Turns out that holds true pretty much across the country. About 50% of the time that domestic violence takes place, alcohol or drugs are being used. Now, I've been in some communities where it's much higher. I was doing trainings in a small rural Alaskan community. There, 90% of the time the domestic violence took place, alcohol was being used. Alcohol was a huge problem in that community. But I've been in others where it's as low as 10% of the time, but it averages out to about 50% of the time. So right there, we know that's not the cause, right? Because for a cause, we're looking at 100% of the time. We used to think that alcohol and drugs were disinhibitors. You might do something under the influence you wouldn't otherwise do. We've all heard that, right? Well, there's actually been a ton of studies that's helped us rethink that. For example, up in Washington State, some researchers came on a college campus and said, we'd like to get about 300 of you in the gym. We just want to let you drink all the alcohol you can drink, and we just like to watch you. Would that be okay? And the students are like, party! This is the best research project ever, right? They're so excited. So they get in the gym, they're drinking, they're getting louder, they're getting rowdier, and after several hours, the researchers said, there's not a bit of alcohol in anything you drink. So not only did we think they might want to find another school to go to because they'd be pretty embarrassed, right? But also it made us stop to think alcohol and drugs may not be a disinhibitor. It may be the expectation of what drugs and alcohol can do. Every abuser who wants to say, not my fault, I was drunk, not my fault, I was high, he'll make sure he has the drugs and alcohol. He'll send her out to get them. They use that excuse all the time. I'm going to drop down to anger and rage. Remember when we said, that it's not about anger, it's not about rage, because it can stop just like that. The target punching and kicking, that they only do it to the person that they say that they love, and the test that they did. That, and then mental illness. And I will tell you, people say to me all the time, they must be sick. They must be mentally ill to do this to someone. Well, I have a very simplistic, and I own that it's simplistic. But if you think about it, if someone is truly mentally ill, can they only be mentally ill in private and never mentally ill in public? No. But abusers will take labels that will help them. And the number one label that abusers take on is, it's not my fault, I'm bipolar. They use it all the time. Well, I don't know about any of you, but I have friends and family members that I love and adore that have bipolar disorder, and they would never harm someone. But an abuser will use any kind of excuse they can. They also will be interested in having a victim that has a mental health disorder. Why would that be, do you think? Why pick someone as your partner? You have it, right? You have it built-in excuse. When the police show up, oh, she's off her meds. She's out of control. She's mentally ill. It's a perfect kind of excuse to use, right? And so you have to understand that very often they're going to be looking for those kinds of things. So that brings us back to a personal choice to be violent. Now, this was really hard for me when I first started this work, and this is hard for every victim to believe, that someone makes a personal choice to hurt them. Remember, they fell in love with that person, and they think if they could just get everything right, that person will become that wonderful person they fell in love with in the beginning. And so this is really hard to believe. Well, I had a situation that helped me to understand it. I happened to be asked by a police chief in a small rural Marion County community if I would come and do a training. And I said, you tell me the time and the place and I'm there. So I showed up that night and he met me in the driveway and he said, I decided to open up not just to my officers, but everybody in the community. Is that okay with you? And I said, great, the more the merrier. And we get in there and we're actually doing a quiz similar to this one. And I'm talking about a personal choice to be violent, and a woman in the back of the room raises her hand and says, excuse me, but my husband is not making a personal choice to be violent. And I said, I know this is really hard. And I told her about a woman who'd gone out for the day. She came home. She started to make, she was making dinner. He starts to escalate. She calls to the children, call 911. He had unplugged every phone in the house. He knew exactly what he was going to do. Well, as you can imagine, the woman that night, she's shaking her head in the back of the room, and she's like, no. She actually folded up her arms, and she kept mumbling the whole time, the rest of the evening. Nope, she's wrong. I know she's wrong. Well, the officers came up to me afterwards. They're like, are you sure you know what you're talking about? Because she seemed pretty sure that you didn't. And I said, this is so hard. I could have told her 1,000 stories like that. But this is the first time she's hearing that, right? And I happened to be in that same rural community a couple weeks later, and this woman came up to me and she said, do you remember me? And I'm like, oh yeah, I remember you really well. And she said, I was so angry at you that night. I was so furious. And I said, yeah, I was pretty clear about that. And she said, I went home that night. I thought back on every single time he had been violent and realized he made a choice. She could see it for herself. I sometimes wish it was this easy, right? Someone can make a different chance, but we can't make them make that a different choice in what they do, right? Not chance, choice. See, I just put in a new word for you there. We can't make them make the choice to be nonviolent. There is one model for eliminating domestic violence, and that's actually a Native American model. And in some tribes long ago, not today, unfortunately, but in some tribes long ago, if they had an abuser in their midst, they did two things. They surrounded the victim with support, and they went to that abuser and they said, you stop what you're doing or you're out. You lose your home, you lose your position, you lose everything. That's the one model that works with eliminating domestic violence. And when I go around different places and do trainings, I say, start it here and I'll come move here, right? Because I want it everywhere. I want everywhere an abuser goes, people go, not here. And in the workplace is one of the most important places where you can hold an abuser accountable. And what I mean by this is not taking them on. I've done a lot of trainings for corrections officers, and they'll say, I'll just go take care of this, right? And I'm like, no, I don't want to visit you in prison. But really, you have a strong way to deal with this that you don't even know you have. And I'm especially talking to the men in the audience, and I'm so glad there's so many men here today. An abuser always wants other people to give them permission for what they're doing. And what I mean by that is they are going to look for ways to engage you to say what they're doing is okay. And how they do that most often is they'll say things like, oh, you know how women can be. And if men do two things, either laugh and agree with it, or actually are silent, what an abuser thinks, and they talk about this in group all the time, what I believe is that that means they agree with me. And so all you have to do, it's so simple, all you have to do, if you have somebody who is making disparaging remarks about women in general or their partner, all you have to say is, I don't think that way. That's not what I would do with my, wife or girlfriend. I just don't agree with that, and turn around and walk off. You don't have to take them on. You don't have to try to convince them, any of that. You have made a very clear statement of, I don't think that same way you do, because what they believe is that you all do, all the time. And until they find out differently, no one is sending them the message of, no, actually, not everyone does think that way. And abusers are always looking for that. And so they're going to try to engage you. They're going to try to treat other folks really badly and hope that you're going to join in with that. So you have an easy way to be able to deal with that. Now, what is the leading cause of death for women in the workplace? What do you think? Homicide is the number one way, and it has been that for more than 10 years. It's either been number one or number two of how individuals die in the workplace, and domestic violence does come into the workplace. And that's a very scary thing for everyone that's there, and it's very hard to be able to deal with. I don't want to have to respond to any of you, after the fact, so it's great that you're coming and getting information and talking about it, because it is devastating when that happens to a workplace. And being able to say, let's do some things. Let's make sure we're talking about this as an issue is one of the most important things that you can do. And so I'm really glad that you're here today. Number 7, which statement demonstrates the impact on women who work and are victims of domestic violence and or stalking? What do you think? All of the above. And what I want you to know is abusers are going to be doing things in the workplace. And this kind of goes with the next one. I'm going to do two together. Abusers and stalkers harass this percentage of employed women at work, either in person or over the telephone. What do you think that number is? It's 74% of the time. 74% of the time. And what I want you to understand is if you have an abuser in your workplace, chances are they're using the resources to be able to stalk and harass their partners. If you have a victim in your workplace, chances are that is coming over into the workplace. And I mentioned earlier about someone, you may work with someone and they're getting hundreds of calls. And what I want you to understand is however they're doing it, whether they're showing up, whether they're the person is calling in late all the time, because there's actually research that shows that abusers will do things to make sure their victims are late to work. Why do you think they want all these things to be going on in the victim's workplace? What would be the motivation behind that? So you can probably guess they like the income, right? And chances are, if you're working with a victim, chances are they may not have access to that income. So they want the access to the income, but they want them always on the edge of losing their job. Why on the edge of losing their job? Yeah, they're not going to control, right? And they're also not going to ever feel stable enough to say, I can do something different. I can go somewhere else. I can make it on my own. Keeping them always off being stable, right? And so all those activities have a motivation behind them. Because what they know is going to be going on, and this happens, and if you've done this, do not blame yourself because you didn't know. What happens for every employee is, why am I having to pick up the load for that person, right? Why can't they do their job? Why can't they get here on time? Why didn't they arrange for childcare? Well, chances are that abuser said, oh, I'm with the kids, I got this. And then we'll say, oh, I got to go here, I got to do that. They have that motivation behind it. They may even, if you have any managers, it's not surprising when abusers actually call up the managers and say, you know, I've been noticing some things at home, and I'm wondering if you're noticing some problems at work. Well, think about it. Then that manager starts to think, well, I kind of have noticed some things, right? And maybe there is something going on, and everybody starts to watch them, and so that person becomes even more withdrawn because they're worried about losing their job. They're worried about what people know. They're worried about what people think. It makes them puts them in an impossible situation. And so all these kinds of tactics, chances are the abuser is using. The workplaces where people rally around that person, rally around the victim and say, we're going to support you. We know this is part of the tactics. You got the most loyal employees in the world because they know that workplace understands that this isn't them doing it. They're not trying to be a bad employee. And I want to be really clear about this because sometimes folks think I'm saying, you know, that you can't say, well, if an employee is not doing their job, you can't do something about that. You can. You can. But there are protections in place. There is leave to be able to take. They can go get that protection order. They can work with a program like ours. There are things that can be done to help support that person to be able to bring back the employee that you had that was really good, or help them to become that great employee. You still can hold them accountable for work-related things, but you also can give them the support to help them become one of the best employees. And I've seen that time and again, and I've heard that from managers from Department of Justice. I've heard that from managers in Department of Revenue. I've heard that from all over the state, folks talking about that I had, once I understood the dynamics and once I understood what was going on, we place those supports around that person, and I have one of the best employees I've ever been able to have. And coworkers being able to know, like a lot of times I hear from them, what do I do? How do I support this person? How do I talk to them? And once you understand about being able to say things, I'm worried for you, I'm concerned for you and your children, that you're putting that information out there, but you're also helping them to know that there are resources available to them that can help them. We have folks that will just put our packet out of information, right? They just have it in their cubicle. And guess what? It usually leaves and goes somewhere else. We have folks that put posters up. It's just a poster that says our information, and people call us from those posters. It's a simple thing that is just amazingly effective that you can do. You can say to a coworker, I'm just concerned for you. I hope, if you ever think that you'd like to, that you might go see somebody at the Center for Hope and Safety or whatever the local program is. All of that, you may not think it, but it really does make a difference. What is the most important thing you can say to a victim of domestic violence or stalking? What do you think? I believe you, and it's not your fault. People will say to me, oh, that's too simplistic, that's nothing. But what I can tell you is survivors tell us all the time, I never forgot the first person who said to me, it does make a difference. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to say, oh, I'm getting out right now because someone said that. But think about that abuser has put thousands of hours of tapes in her head that this is all your fault. No one's ever going to believe you. There's nowhere you can go. And think if you're the first person or the 20th person or the 100th person that's helping to undo those tapes that are going off in her head. It is so incredibly important. Now, I'm going to see, does Teresa owe any of you $20 today? Because you didn't learn at least one new thing. Anyone not learn at least one new thing? Oh, you're off the hook. You don't have to pay them $20. I did a training one time and a person said to me, you owe me $100. I learned 5 new things. I'm like, I'm not paying you if you learn new things. I was paying you if you didn't. I don't tell that story to actually tease, folks about the $20. I actually tell that story for a reason. Something happened about 3 weeks after that training of Rotarians that I want you to know about. I had a man come up to me who I'm guessing was in his mid-70s, and he said to me, Jane, I would have told you before your training that I had never met a victim of domestic violence. Well, you know, given those stats, that's probably not the case, right? But he believed that he had never met a victim before in his life. And he said, a week after your training, a young woman came up to me who I've known her whole life, and she started talking to me about that her boyfriend was hurting her. And he said, before your training, I would have said, oh, he must have been drunk, or he must have saw it as a child. And he said, I knew what to say to her. And I said, you're a different person now. And I tell that story because if you came in with any of the myths and you got rid of them today, chances are more people will disclose to you than ever before. Now, don't freak out. Sometimes you go, if all you say is, I believe you, and it's not your fault, I want you to know how big that is. If you can go one step further and say, there's a program that can help you. If you can go one step further from that and say there are things in place to help you be able to take a little leave and get a protection order or move, and there's places that can help you with being able to do that. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. Every time you make the workplace safer, you have changed someone's life. And what I mean by that is when they've done surveys of survivors and they've said, where are the two places you feel safest when you've been in an abusive relationship? Can you guess where those two places are? Work is one of them, and church. Work and church. And so we do a lot of trainings with faith communities to try to say, let's help you make that even a safer place, right, for individuals. But work is always number one. And so you can have a part in making your workplace the safest place it can be, and also have that understanding, those dynamics, so you can help someone that is going through that. And then, which of the following are necessary in every workplace that wants to address domestic violence and stalking? So I know you have workforce. There's usually a part of your safety planning for your, overall, like what if there's an emergency? Where do you go? What do you do? Usually there's a part in there on domestic violence. If there's not in yours, let me know. I'll come help you develop that. I've done it for many, many different workplaces. I'm happy to do that. If you have one and you don't go over it every once in a while, I encourage you to do that. Because part of a really simple safety plan in any workplace is to have a code word. Say you have a workplace where an abuser could show up, and you have somebody in your workplace that's dealing with this. If everybody knows what that code word is and it gets used, in some agencies they use the code word and all the managers come forward. Other places they use the code word, everybody comes forward because they're a really small agency. But the important part of it is everybody's clear about what it is, and everybody knows what to do. And if you can talk that through and you can really think about that, it can make all the difference in that moment when you might need it. The hard part is these don't happen, you may not know when these are going to happen, and so you don't think about, oh, we should have this, we should talk about this or review this every once in a while. But even if it's that you have a suspicion that somebody in your workplace is going through something, and you just say, we're going to have a general review of these policies or procedures and how this goes, what I can tell you is a lot of times people would say, I think we have somebody who's being victimized in our agency, but they aren't talking to anybody. They're not telling anybody. What they would do is they'd bring me in to do a basic DV 101, and there wasn't one of those, not one, in all my career where that person didn't either come up to me that day or call later. Not one time. So that's a simple thing you can do, is just say, we're going to have these trainings on a regular basis so folks can, understand and know where they can get help and support. It makes a huge difference. If you can have, if you can understand your policies around respecting the confidentiality of victims and how important that is. If your coworker says to you, this is happening to me, but I don't want you to tell anyone, understand what those guidelines are. If you can help them get that support and keep it as confidential as possible, that's great. If it's going to impact the safety of everyone there, being able to talk that through and help them understand how important that's going to be for someone to know that can actually do something. All of those things are incredibly important. So I have rushed through this really quickly because I want to make sure I save time for questions that you have. And so I want you all to ask me questions. And we're going to get a microphone to you so you can do that. I'm sorry, you didn't know I was worried I was going to run out of time. Folks have any questions? I was so clear you have no questions. Oh, awesome.
You're right. I learned a ton. I am the father of a 14-year-old girl, and now I'm scared to death. So what can we do as parents when you're facing teenage daughters at this age?
I love that you're asking that question, and I get that question actually a lot from fathers because they're scared, right? So one of the best things that you can do is you can actually talk about this. You can say, I went to a training today. I talked to some folks about, when one person hurts another person when they're in a relationship. I want just to make sure that you know what the resources are. I want you to know that if anyone ever, says, don't tell your dad about something because, if you love me, you won't do that. That actually is a really big sign of control. If they act like they're jealous, you can actually go through those warning signs and do it in a way that's at their age level. And we have a youth services coordinator. If they ever want to talk to that person, they can talk to them confidentially and be able to talk through any concerns they have. They're actually in the schools. They actually talk to 3,000 to 4,000 youth a year. And what they do is they talk to youth about how to support their friends because most youth don't go to adults. And so we actually give them the tools about teen dating violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, how to prevent that because many of them will be approached for human trafficking. And then actually we talk to them about the dangers of pornography. And so we're in lots of schools in Marion County talking about that you can read through our packet. We have a teen section on that. Be able to start those conversations because what I hear from parents all the time, and I just worked with one this week, they were devastated, right? Why didn't I know this? How didn't I see the warning signs? And so if a partner's trying to keep them away from you in some way, huge warning signs. You're going to be so much more prepared. Now, you really will. And keep asking those questions. How do I deal with this? Because that's going to be some of the most important ways to support your teen. Yeah. It's so good. Are you all sitting here thinking, wow, I wish I had known this with a family member or a friend? Yeah. And it's very common. Don't worry about what you did before. Even if it's with a coworker, I had a lot of guilt for managers about, I lost a good employee or I should have known this. Don't do that to yourselves because you don't know what you don't know with this. And who would ever think that there are a few people that live their life to do this to someone else? And they will. They'll just go from one partner to another. So you had no way of knowing that if you did something that you now think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Let go of that just from here on out. Do what you can to be there for someone. I just want to make sure, another question.
I've heard that when you know someone who's in this situation, that it's a good idea to keep kind of an emergency getaway bag for them. And it seems to make sense to me, a change of clothes, some cash, a disposable phone, things that they might need to get away, even if you've tried to convince them to get away. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. I love that question. It's a great idea. It's a great idea. And if they feel comfortable with even storing some copies of paperwork, don't let anyone ever say to you, I need to get my paperwork and they might go into a dangerous situation to get them. We'll help them get replacements of paperwork. I don't want folks to feel like that, but if they can do a bag, an emergency bag, and keep it somewhere, we don't tend to talk a lot about it publicly just because then abusers start going, where's your bag? Where are you keeping it if they're worried that that person is leaving them? And so we talk very much with them about all of those things. And we have 911 cell phones. If you have old cell phones, doesn't matter how old they are, doesn't matter if they don't work anymore, bring them to us. We give out hundreds of 911 cell phones every year. The ones that don't work anymore, we actually can send them away. We can get more phones to be able to help people. But if you have used cell phones, bring them to us. We make sure we recycle them appropriately, and we do use those. And so we can make sure even a friend has an emergency 911 cell phone. You can come in and say, I'd like to get one for a friend. We're going to give it to you. So it's a great thing. So.
Hi, everyone. Could you talk a little bit more about perpetrators and like how do they end up in that situation? What did you call what did you call it?
Batter intervention?
Batter intervention. How do they end up in that situation, and do they ever get better?
I was waiting for someone to ask me that question. Can they change? And the answer to that is absolutely, they can change. The hard part is they don't want to. So I actually served on the Attorney General's Batter Intervention Standards Committee for many years. And so I looked at all the programs all across the United States. What batter intervention programs claimed was a 10% overall success rate. Not great already, right? But you had to be careful, because what one program would say is a success is he hits her once a week instead of 4 times a week. That's not a success in my mind. What the folks that I believe are most on top of this say about 2% of the time they see someone make a choice to stop using any forms of violence. What you have to be careful about is an abuser can stop what could get them arrested. The easiest thing for an abuser to stop is the physical violence. What is harder for them is to stop all the power and control things that they're trying to do. And I'll give you, if I have time, and you told me I got 4 minutes, I can tell you this story. So I was sitting in on a batter intervention class in Duluth, Minnesota, and they have their own model of batter intervention. And that night I was there was a man that was doing the facilitating, and he had been all around the country. So I was really excited about seeing him do this. And that night they were having the men act out on each other what they had done to their partners. So one man was down on the floor, and this other man was standing over him and said, I choked my wife. Well, you all know you choke on food. What was he doing? Strangling her, potentially very lethal. So he was showing that. He gets up and he sits down. The facilitator says, what could you have done differently? And the man said, well, instead of choking her, I could have withheld the checkbook, and then she would have had to do what I wanted. And the facilitator that night said, yes, you could have done that. Well, I'm, sitting in my chair freaking out, and I can't say anything during the group. But afterwards, I said, do you realize you just gave him permission to trade one form of power and control for another? He may never do anything that he'll be arrested for, but he's going to use economic abuse against his partner. Well, as you can imagine, that facilitator didn't like me very much, and he said, no, you're wrong. But guess what happened to that facilitator a couple of years after I had been there? He got fired. He was arrested for domestic violence. So you think about I'm not going to do this that I can be held accountable, but I'm going to do something else that gets me what I want. And so they absolutely can change. They have to want to do that change. And as a society, we have to be able to say, we're not going to allow you. So I want to wrap up by saying, thank you so much for giving this time to come and hear about a topic that's not easy to hear about. If you have anyone in your life or yourself that you need our help, we want you to know we're there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and we want to be of help. So thank you all very much. You were great, and I'd be happy to stay and take questions. So thank you very much.
For your time today. 3 very quick things. First, again, thank you. That was wonderful. And I hope folks who have questions can stay for a couple minutes if they do. Right across the street at DHS, there's a great interactive display around Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I encourage you all to check it out because there are some activities that you can participate in at the display to continue this education. Secondly, I'll make sure to send this out as well, but of course, if anyone does want to talk about a safety plan at work, please reach out to your manager or human resources business partner so we can make sure that that gets started. And thirdly, I want to thank the Equity and Inclusion Council for hosting this event, and again to all of you for attending. And as always, this is being recorded. We'll send out the recorded version to all staff, so everyone who wants to see it again can always do that. Thank you all again. Take care.